Hey guys, Simply Betta here. Do you remember when I destroyed my fish room? You probably do because I made like 10 videos about it, with more is coming out too. It's not done yet. Well, there was one 20-gallon tank in there that I refused to dismantle. I didn't break it down like my other fish tanks, I just moved it out into my living area. I'm gonna keep in this little tank. Just has some pearl weed in it and floaters, but I like it. Not getting rid of it. This tank had a lot of potential. Like it wasn't the best looking tank, but it had a substrate in it that was actually pretty nice. It's Brightwell's volcanic substrate, which is a nutrient-rich substrate for plants. It's not like gravel, it's like an aquatic soil. And there was this big, beautiful crypt Florida sunset that I had in it that's kind of towards the back. I never really got to see it because the way the tank was on my rack, but it was a big, healthy plant. And there was also some Vesuvius swords in it, which are the really pretty curlicue type sword plants, and a bunch of floating plants, and that's pretty much it. Like, it wasn't the best tank in the world, but I wanted to bring it out of the fish room and make it into something that looked a little nicer. There were a few sprigs of pearlweed in it too, but due to it being kind of like a low light, neglected tank, the pearlweed didn't do very good. The plants were stable, but they didn't grow very much because I didn't fertilize the tank, I didn't have good light, I didn't really do anything. The hair algae did really great in this tank though, mostly because I would forget to turn the light off for a couple days at a time because I didn't have a timer. Let's not talk about that. This tank is not the best looking thing in the world, and I decided to put a little bit of love into it and actually spruce it up, make it into a tank that I can be proud of. To do that, I wanted CO2. So if you really want your aquatic plants to grow fast, to be really lush, to be really thick and bushy, you need CO2. Okay, you don't need CO2, but if you didn't have CO2, you would need so much patience. I just want this tank to look good as fast as I can, so I wanted to put CO2 in it. The problem is that I didn't want to have to buy a whole new pressurized CO2 setup because you have to buy like the canister, you have to fill it up, you have to get a regulator, you have to get all the attachments, and that adds up, especially because this is kind of a low effort tank and I didn't really want to do that. Didn't want to buy more stuff right now when I'm trying to move. A whole new setup, like a decent setup, would cost several $100s minimum. So I decided to go the DIY route because that's just the spirit of my channel most of the time. And I made a do-it-yourself yeast and sugar CO2 setup. I just wanted to try a basic CO2 setup and see how it did. And see if I could take this tank and just give it a little boost and make it look pretty. This tank's gonna be an experiment to see how this type of CO2 setup does. This is what the tank looked like after having it out of the fish room for 1 week. At this time, it had had DIY CO2 for about a week. The sad little neglected sprigs of pearlweed are starting to perk up. They're enjoying the more intense lighting, the aquatic plant fertilizer, the CO2. The crypt Florida sunset is looking pretty much the same. It's a nice plant. And my Vesuvius, which is that really cool spirally sword plant, is pretty much the same. So this Vesuvius hasn't grown or made new leaves or runners or really done anything since transplanting them into this tank a long time ago. So at this point, I'm just really hoping that I see something happen. I really want this plant to just grow and thrive because it's so pretty. This is the DIY CO2 setup. I made this out of 2 empty Sprite bottles and then some of those little screw top things that you can buy off of eBay. I don't know what they're called. I'll just link them down below because they're really cheap. I rigged them together and then I also added a diffuser onto an air line. I have the diffuser placed inside the tank near my little hang-on back filter near the outflow so that the current wicks the CO2 bubbles away into the tank. So that way the CO2 bubbles have some more time to kind of disperse into the water. I got myself a CO2 drop checker. That way I can see what the CO2 levels are like in the tank. So I left it in overnight and I came back to it. Check out the reading at the next morning. It looks like the DIY setup is working. Well, of course it's working. I just wanted to know how much it was working. On to week 2. The pearlweed is really perking up with more noticeable growth this week. Unfortunately, so is the hair algae. I'm hoping that having the light on a timer, having healthier fertilized plants and CO2 would discourage the hair algae growth, but it doesn't look like it has yet. I see some new growth on my Vesuvius, which I am stoked about. I want a lot of this plant. You see, that leaf is new, and that one, I'm so happy. The crypt looks great too. Such a nice plant. My drop checker is reading high CO2 levels. I'm okay with that. My fish don't mind. Like, it's not like my fish are gonna suffocate if the CO2 is too high. I remade my yeast and sugar solution, but only in 1 bottle this time, because I guess 2 bottles was a little bit too much. So I think this will lower my levels down a little bit, just having 1 bottle going instead of both. Making the food's pretty straightforward. I just take 2 cups of white sugar, pour that into a bottle. I fill the bottle with some warm water, kind of sort of near the top. I'll use half a teaspoon of yeast and I'll proof it out. After I start to see some bubbles, I'll just pour it in. It's pretty easy. Okay, it's been like 2 months since I filmed last. I might even be wearing the same shirt. I had big plans for this DIY CO2 tank, and then the holidays happened, trying to sell my house happened, my whole life happened, and my tank kind of got put on the back burner. I ignored it, and it got overgrown, to say the least. Like, super overgrown. I basically ignored it for months because of my life happening. The floating plants on the top, the frog bit just went crazy and did this. A lot of my pearl weed that I'd been growing had died, and I think my Vesuvius might be gone. Let's take this lid off. Wow. So obviously, guys, the lesson here should be that if you have floating plants, they're really, really great. But if left unchecked, they can really choke the life out of your other plants by just robbing all of the light. So you can't let it become like this. Don't do this. Don't do what Simply Betta has done. I'm sure you don't do that, but for some reason, I just couldn't bring myself to take a few seconds to scoop some frog bit out and just get rid of it. I fully admit that this disaster is all my fault. Is this fish tank a metaphor for my life? Well, let's fix it. I think I might have to have a frog bit sale on my website after I release this video. Obviously, the first thing to do right now is to get rid of all this floating plants. So much. Oh my goodness, Taylor. Look at this horrible mess. At least my precious little Crypt Florida sunset is okay. I don't see my Vesuvius anywhere. Way to go. It's back there. All right. I have a little piece of Vesuvius. My pearl weed is really melted back. Look at all this frog bit. Taylor, Simply Betta, shame on you. Shame on you. Look at it compared to the size of my head. Look at that. It's so much. I spent some time reaching in and taking out as much algae and debris as I could just with my hands. I also removed a couple filters I had sitting in there and some moss ledges. And now here's what it looks like. I'm pretty much back to square one. I'll let my filter run for a bit and just clean up the water a bit. I just did a water change. I pretty much have to start over. I'm fairly low on patience nowadays, so instead of waiting for my one remaining Vesuvius to become happy and throw runners and fill up this space, which could take like a year at this rate or 10, I bought some new Vesuvius. No regrets. I need the instant gratification. I also bought some more pearl weed, though I couldn't quite tell if mine had frozen a little in the mail. Don't buy plants during snowstorms. Don't do what Simply Betta does. The pearl weed came from another person's tank, so I did a quick 5% bleach dip to make sure I didn't bring in any pests. That probably made this pearl weed even more dead. Then I rinsed the plants in dechlorinated water for a while to get that bleach off. I did my best to pick up the hair algae by hand, then I planted my lovely Vesuvius. I'm truly excited for this plant. I hope it thrives. Ideally, it will fill in and be my background plant. The pearl weed was next. I broke up the stems, which I hope survived, and I planted them all around the front. I'll be able to tell in a few days if they'll take or if they'll just melt away because of the freezing and the bleach. Now, I wait. It's been 1 week since the do-over. And you know what? My tank is looking pretty nice. The CO2 levels are definitely being impacted by the DIY contraption. The plants are looking better. I thought I had for sure killed all of the pearl weed with both the freezing and then the bleach, but some of it came back. Now I just have to keep the CO2 levels consistent and the fertilizer consistent, and I think everything's going to be just fine. I think I'm gonna make this tank look really pretty. Going the DIY yeast and sugar route is definitely a little bit more of a hassle, just because you have to remake it once a week and it's easy to forget and it's just like one more thing to do in your life. But oh well, I'm gonna stay on it. I'm gonna keep doing it, just to say that I did. Because this is the only fish tank that I saved from my fish room before I ripped it out, this fish tank's special to me. I could have gone out and gotten a 20-gallon long-ish, like fancy rimless tank, but I didn't. I kept this tank, and I really want to make it look nice with the DIY spirit. So wish me luck, guys. I think I'll make another update video in like a month or two when I can finally show a whole lot of growth. Have you guys ever used CO2 like this with the yeast and sugar and then tried to keep it consistent? Or have you gone the pressurized route? Or low tech? Be sure to sub if you haven't already and hit that little notification bell for me, and I'll see you next time.